Good day to you. I'm coming to you from a hotel in the Hudson Valley where my wife and I are taking a brief semi vacation while I'm still teaching my class. I'm staying in a hotel and I went out to get some tea this morning, and there was a customer, a person who's staying in the hotel, who was sitting there with his mask down while he was drinking his coffee. I mean, I guess that's the only way you can drink coffee, right? With your mask down. What would happen if he passed on COVID to somebody else in the hotel? Of course, I'm not wishing that on anybody. I'm asking what would happen. What would the hotel do? They were supposed to have procedures in place to avoid people getting COVID. What would be the fallout for this particular hotel and for the Marriott chain? It's a question that all hotels are ready to go with today. They're ready to go with disastrous news like COVID ravaging customers in their hotel. They have to be ready to go with public relations that are going to repair the image of their brand. It's just a fact in the business world and the media world as well that you have to have public relations ready to go. It's like my shirt here is a Penn State shirt, and it illustrates how you never know what can go wrong in public relations. You could be sitting there saying, why is he wearing a Penn State shirt when he's an ESU professor? It seems to be making a slight against ESU. Well, in fact, I have a degree from Penn State. I have 2 degrees. I have a master's degree and a Ph.D. That's why I wear it. But it's just an example of how important public relations is and how important it is for you as an organization, if you're a part of an organization, I should say, to be aware of your public relations. So that's what we're talking about today. We're taking on Chapter 12, Public Relations, and public relations, or PR as it is referred to, has kind of a checkered reputation in the United States. And I say checkered because some people think of PR as simply mopping up a mess and trying to put a good face on it. That's sort of the bad side of PR. Oh, that's just PR. It's just a company telling you that they're interested in the environment when really they're drilling for oil and polluting the environment. That's one view of PR. But actually, PR is a solid discipline with a core of ethics. And if practiced properly, it's very important not only to the field of PR, but to the organizations that PR is serving. And that's why we have a public relations concentration in the major of communication. We have a PR concentration. We founded that concentration some 10, 15 years ago, and it has grown into a really viable option for students seeking PR as a career. What is PR about? It's really all about an organization or an individual that are either of which are trying to relate to a wide range of publics. It's about an organization or an individual who are trying to relate to a wide range of publics. And publics is a term that's referred to as a group of people who share a common set of interests. So ESU, for example, as an organization, has several publics that it appeals to, and each public gets a different message. You've got parents. Parents want to know their kids are safe when they're here at ESU. So a lot of the messaging that goes out, public relations-wise, is about safety to parents. Students want to know that they're going to have freedoms when they're here that they haven't had before, especially 18-year-olds. So a lot of content that goes out is about what students can do while they're here at ESU. Alumni, a third public, wants to know that the institution is continuing on in a way that is representing the past when they were here at ESU. And so that's yet another public. It's an example of publics that are served by public relations. So let's dig deeper into this field now as we are taking on a part of mass media that doesn't have to do with development of technologies like we've looked at in the past, but is looking at broad areas of content. In this case, public relations. And the origins of public relations, according to the book, go back to the American Revolution in the 1700s with Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, Paine. He was an agitator against the English crown. He was trying to get the colonies to have a revolution and to separate and form their own country. And so he was going around posting flyers all over Philadelphia and other places that were talking about the benefits of becoming independent from Britain. Now, you can decide for yourself whether that's actually public relations. I mean, I want you as a critical reader in not only this class, but all of your classes, to constantly be saying, is the author offering an opinion here that I agree with? Don't always treat the authors of your textbooks as factual. Sometimes there's information that you yourself are an expert on that you're able to challenge. At any rate, the first form of PR is said by the author to have occurred in the 1700s. But PR really grew during, guess what? The Industrial Revolution. PR grew during the industrial revolution because companies grew into big monopolies and big corporations, and they also grew in their bureaucracies, the different departments that you have working: manufacturing, you have sales, you have insurance, you have all these departments that are taking place in these big companies that are growing up. And so companies needed to manage their images, or otherwise they would lose scores of sales, like this hotel might lose if COVID takes place. So they were really interested in managing their images. One of the first people to use public relations not for a good purpose, and a person who helped contribute to the bad name for PR that some people have, was P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, does that name ring a bell? Yeah, P.T. Barnum at the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And what P.T. Barnum was doing was, as the circus was traveling across the country, before they would get to the next town, he would write anonymous letters to the newspaper in that town complaining about what a hoax the circus was. And the end result of that is people said, well, we want to see for ourselves whether the circus is a hoax, so we're going to go out and go to the circus, which is exactly what he wanted. So it kind of gives rise to that saying, there's no such thing as bad PR. No matter what the news is, it draws attention to the organization. So P.T. Barnum was the person who got sort of the bad name of PR going, because he wasn't honest, right? He was writing anonymous letters when it was really him, the owner of the circus. So next we're going to talk about how PR in these early days was mostly one-way communication, mostly from the organization to the publics, without any return communication, without any feedback. And there was a name for this style of public relations. As we look back on it historically, we call this kind of PR press agentry. Press agentry. It's like you're holding a press conference and you're going to tell the audience what they want to hear, and whether they want to speak back or not is up to your control. It's really more this kind of PR about building publicity than about managing the image. And Standard Oil was another example. Standard Oil, the company, the Rockefeller company that started in Pennsylvania, it's another example of press agentry. It used to send out news articles as paid advertisements. So it would advertise a new oil product for your car, and it would present it as a news article and then run at the bottom, paid advertisement. So it's an example of PR being used as a press agentry form of communication, just from us to you. Now let's talk about the beginnings of image management, as those in the field started to realize that it was more important to pay attention to managing the image than drawing publicity. So the first person that we're going to talk about, the first organizations that we're going to talk about that were interested in image management, were the railroads. The railroads like you have on your monopoly board, like Reading Railroad, for example, which is right here in Pennsylvania. They weren't monopolies, they were oligopolies, right? Just a few companies owning the railroads, and that's how people traveled. There were cars, but most people traveling by train. And what the railroads started doing is they started bribing reporters. They started bribing reporters not to criticize their monopolies or oligopolies. They started to do that by offering these reporters cash, in the pocket cash, and free travel passes. I mean, that's bribery right there. So later on, utility companies, which would be electric companies and telephone companies, utility companies and phone companies, they use PR also for image management. For example, AT&T required newspapers in which it ran ads to only run positive stories about their actions. Otherwise, they'd pull the advertising. So PR gets off to a kind of dubious start with these kind of unethical behaviors. Well, that starts to change with who we know as one of the co-founders of the field of public relations, making it a studied discipline with a moral compass. This co-founder, there's another co-founder I'm going to mention in a moment, his name was Ivy Lee, L-E-E. Ivy Lee, spelled like the plant, Ivy Lee. And what he came from a background of economics and psychology. So he put these two things together. Economics and psychology. He was really interested in consumer spending in a lot of ways, and he thought that it was important that companies who wanted to engage in positive PR, that they put a human face on corporations. They put a human face, because Ivy Lee thought the public will react more strongly to symbols and phrases that are put out by a company, symbols and phrases, rather than rational arguments. They'll react to the golden arches, for example, which is a combo of advertising and PR. It's public relations about this beautiful place you can go to with golden fries and golden M. It's going to protect you. It's going to deliver the same burger that you always get. And so this is Ivy Lee. This is Ivy Lee saying don't just show a company, put a human face on it. Have the president come out and speak. Have a Ronald McDonald, if you need to, come out and speak for McDonald's. Have a person who is taking away this blank, humanless corporation image to the public. Ivy Lee also was the first to deal with crisis management. He talked about how you need to be prepared for a crisis at all times, not after the crisis happens. And so one of the things that he said was you have to apologize and you have to tell the truth. And he said, interestingly enough, that you tell the truth as a PR specialist, not because it's right, but because people will find out anyway. So telling them the truth is actually more effective. It's more effective than lying to the public. And Ivy Lee actually came up with a declaration of principles. You can see that in the links, among the other links that I've sent out in the email today, which will talk to you about how he's developing a set of ethics that PR professionals should abide by. Now we're going to move to the next co-founder. His name was Edward Bernays, Bernays, and interestingly enough, he was a nephew of the famous psychologist Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays was. And he comes from a social science background. And what that means is using surveys to gather quantitative data to show how people feel about something and how they are likely to act. So it's like opinion polls. That's what Edward Bernays did. And he came up with the phrase to describe that, his process of measuring and creating public opinion. And he called that phrase engineering consent. Engineering consent. Think about that. Engineering. It's like this mathematical, scientific process to get people to agree. That's what consent is all about. And so he used research techniques that were based in the social sciences to do that. So among the things that he did was he delivered news from credible or admired sources. So if there's going to be news that's coming out about something that is bad news or good news, you want to have a person who is thought of very, very highly. For example, Colin Powell, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a former general in the Army who has served many presidents over the United States, Republican and Democrat. So he's being interviewed now on what happened in Washington. And in part, he's being interviewed because he has this reputation that he's an admired person. He's sort of out of politics. He's not political. He's what's best for the country. It's an example of engineering consent by delivering news from credible sources. Unfortunately, Bernays also said that you can manipulate people without knowing it. You can manipulate people without knowing it. And some of his PR actually did that. It converted women to be cigarette smokers. And it did that. You can see the ads and the links that I've sent out by showing women with imagery that shows them as free and as powerful. And so they're independent women in these ads. And so what he's really selling is power and independence by virtue of smoking a cigarette. But what Ed Bernays contributed the most to PR as a profession was two-way interaction between individuals and organizations. He did away with press agentry. That's why he did polling, right? So you're actually seeing what consumers are interested in, what they think of your company. In addition, Edward Bernays promoted PR as a profession, not just an occupation, but a profession that has a set of standards and also draws on people who have an academic background, like our program in public relations. Next up, we're going to talk about a time period in which PR was used by the federal government. This would be World War I. World War I was a war that most American citizens did not want to get involved in. That was Europe's problem. But the federal government decided that we have to get involved, otherwise the free world is going to be threatened. And so it actually formed a committee called the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, the government did, to build American support for the war. And so the government is trying to build support using public relations. And it drew on opinion leadership, this committee. It drew on people who were thought of highly by others because of the respect that they had earned in their occupations. So it brought on journalists. It brought on politicians. It brought on business people. It brought on actors. It brought on authors. It brought on teachers to talk about the benefits of entering the war. And in addition, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, he used to have regular press conferences. That's the first time that we get press conferences in the White House. In the presidency was Woodrow Wilson, in part because of public relations to build support for the war. So PR does become a profession in the 1940s and 50s. Universities in the 40s and 50s start to offer degrees like our degree here at ESU. And also television starts to come on the scene in the 40s and 50s, providing yet a new way for companies through television to express public relations. In the 1960s, PR faced some challenges because the media started to actually, instead of supporting the government all the time, actually became more critical of business and government because of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, a movement that we are seeing having legs today as we ask questions like, what if the people who had stormed the Capitol were black? Would they have been treated the same? Most people think no, as the other quote-unquote protesters. So this is an example of the challenges in the modern day that were also faced in the 1960s, but the issues were the Vietnam War, which a lot of people didn't understand why we're there, and the civil rights movement, which were challenging pre-existing white privilege structures. Now let's go on to talk about the business of public relations. And we're going to start by talking about the functions of PR in performing the business of public relations. And there's three functions. One is informing, and that is to inform the public by sending out a variety of information. It can be press releases that are announcing a new product or a new vaccine, for example. That's one function. A second function is persuading people to change their attitudes. There's a lot of persuasion that's going on right now, trying to persuade the public to get behind impeachment or to get behind Article 25, or on the opposite side of the fence, to get behind resisting these kinds of efforts. There's a lot of public relations that you're going to see on television and on news shows in these next few days. So that's the second function, is persuading. And then the third function is integrating. Integrating is where you bring publics and institutions together through shared goals. You bring publics and institutions together through shared goals. Our previous president of ESU, Dr. Marcia Welsh, used to have a program in place where at the beginning of the semester, a group of ESU employees and she would walk around neighborhoods in Stroudsburg and ask people what they thought of the East Stroudsburg University students who lived in their neighborhoods. And she would hear all kinds of things. Oh, they're sweet, they make me feel young, to they pee on my lawn after they go to parties and throw trash. This is a good example of trying to bring the public, those surrounding neighbors, into contact with ESU and to integrate their interests together, because ESU has an interest in the neighbors being happy with ESU being there, and the neighbors have an interest in ESU doing what it can to control the students' behavior in areas that are not so nice in public. Now let's go on to the next area that we're talking about in the business of public relations, and it's the modern day definition of PR. The modern day definition of PR is the management function that establishes and maintains mutually beneficial relationships between an organization and the publics on whom its success or failure depends. Now that's a long definition. You can get it from the chapter to get the exact words. And that's what the modern day definition of PR is as it's developed and become more sophisticated. And in fact, Edward Bernays says that PR is a public good. It's a public good. It's necessary for the proper functioning of society. You can think about that statement on your own. Now let's talk about the PR process, what it involves today. If you hire a PR consultant, of which there are many, or you hire one of the PR firms, the PR process involves research. That's the first step. That is trying to understand the problems or the issues that an organization is facing, like J.C. Penney, a big retailer from the past, king of the mall, J.C. Penney was, and it's just been losing money, and then COVID hits and people shopping online. What's the problem there? Is it just simply that people can shop online, or is there something to do with the products of JCPenney or the image of the company? Is JCPenney a term that's even relevant or interesting to people today? Research will uncover that. Then secondly, in the PR process, you have objectives. Objectives are setting measurable objectives, like we want to see sales increase, or we want to see public opinion turn more favorably towards the person that we're asking the opinion about. You set measurable objectives. Most times they're quantitative, like X amount of increase in sales or X amount of increase in the polls, and sometimes they're more qualitative, like we would just like to hear people that we meet on the subway talking more positively about this company. That's the second step in the process. The third step is programming. And that's planning activities to carry out the objectives. Are you going to do a campaign on television? Are you going to do a social media campaign? What is going to be the content of that campaign? Fourthly, you have the step of evaluation. Evaluation is very important in PR, that you are able to study whether what you are doing is actually working. And that's what evaluation is for. What could we have done better? That's kind of what your purpose is as a student in a class that you're taking at ESU at the end of the semester. When you're asked to rate your professor, you're providing evaluation that hopefully the professor is going to use to improve their style of teaching. And then lastly, the last part of the PR process is stewardship. Stewardship is maintaining those relationships that you created through previous steps. You have to maintain those relationships that you establish at ESU with its neighbors. Once you establish it, it's not automatically there for the rest of time. No, you have to keep circling back and having conversations, because new issues may emerge, like when all this road construction takes place. And we have a roundabout where you enter ESU and the bridge is completed when you go over to Giant. We may have an influx of people here and more traffic. Might present a new issue to these publics. So stewardship is all about maintaining those. Now let's go on to further define publics. We've used that term quite a bit today, but there actually is a way of looking at publics by dividing it into two types. You've got internal publics. Those are your employees or the members of the organization, and all the communication is internal. So you've got emails that are communicating that content. You've got chat rooms. You've got phone calls. You've got company events, like a Christmas party. You've got football pools that take place. These are all things that take place that are within the organization that the outside people don't hear about. At ESU, if you're a student, you're going to get that listserv twice a week with warrior notes telling you what's going on at the university. It's internal to our public. Then there's external publics, and external publics involve the media, because public relations involves getting the media involved. And two-way interactions are what you're desiring between the people doing the PR and the media, that you have constant feedback from the media about whether your campaign is working. And then there's also things like press conferences, feature stories in newspapers, photographs that you release on Instagram, news releases. These are some of the ways that you get to external publics. Now let's go on to say some more about crisis communication, which Ivy Lee was first writing about. And nothing tests an organization like an ability to handle a crisis. The Washington, D.C. police force right now is under terrible criticism for not having done more to prevent the siege of our capital. That's PR that's going to have to be put into place after we get through this period of understanding what happened, so that people have trust in the D.C. police force. Again, nothing tests an organization like a crisis, like an airline that crashes, or like chemicals that are found in a candy bar. That tests. And so Ivy Lee said there are certain principles that you have to be prepared to enact. One is to be prepared, and that it means you already have a crisis plan before the crisis happens. And right now, every single airline has a plan. If one of their airplanes goes down, they're ready to come out and deliver a press conference and talk to you about all the things that they're going to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Secondly, as a principle of crisis communication, you should be honest. As we discussed earlier, cover-ups are worse than the original problem. 3, apologize, and not just apologize fakely, apologize and mean it. Apologize and mean it with real action, steps that you're going to take to correct what happened. Fourthly, move quickly. And today, because of social media, that means right away. Really, it doesn't mean waiting until tomorrow. That's too long. It means reacting right away. And finally, communicate with press, which is to say the media, communicate with the media, and your constituencies, your publics, your employees, the stockholders, any government regulators that are involved in your industry, and of course, the customers. All right, let's talk now about PR moving online. Moving online has opened up so many different avenues for PR. When you think about it, in the 1980s, 1990s, online media were coming on the scene, and they started to present for the first time a new channel for PR. No longer would organizations have to rely on getting word into a TV news program or a radio news program or a film. Now, PR organizations can link up directly with their own publics through the internet, because people can visit web pages, people can fill out surveys, people can text opinions. And so the 1980s and 1990s was transformative as an era for public relations, because companies could now bypass media. They could bypass by using websites. And these websites also provide new tools for organizations to understand their publics. And all the clicking that people do can be measured. Contests can be measured. People can be surveyed for their opinions on the web. But also the internet allows situations to go viral. You can have a situation that goes out of your control and you can't do anything about it. Somebody could post a photo of a McDonald's Big Mac and they could put a fly in the burger and put it on the web, and all of a sudden it goes, look what happened. And it may be real or it may be not, but you have also less control over your image. It's a dilemma for media organizations today. Let's talk about the relationship between PR and society now. And we're going to discuss journalism in this context here, and we're talking about PR in the society because there's an estimate by two sociologists named David Altheide, Altheide, and Robert Snow. And they did a study that showed that, get this, 40 to 90% of all news that you see starts out as a press conference or a speech or a press release. So in other words, 40 to 90% of the news that you're seeing on television or on Yahoo News or on Twitter, wherever you get it, is originating from PR by a company. Of course, a company is going to, rather than make an advertisement that has just built a new engine that gets 50 miles to the gallon, it's a gasoline engine, instead of making an ad, they're going to put out a press release that announces this is a scientific achievement, right? But it also serves as an ad. And that also introduces the idea that some public relations is what is known as spin control, which is to say that spin doctors, as they are known, come out and tell you how a story should be portrayed. And you see spin, it's like spinning yarn, right? It's like telling a story. And so you see that mostly in the political world when you see Donald Trump being discussed or Joe Biden being discussed. Depending on who's discussing them, they're trying to spin the situation in their particular direction. And that's what you as a critical consumer, having taken this class, are hopefully studying, right? So that you can be critical and you can say, I recognize this as spin. It's just a form of PR that's taking place. We're going to now move to finishing up our instructor video lecture by talking about PR and political activism. And that is to say that PR can be a very effective arm for political change. Gay marriage, the legalization of marijuana, and now perhaps the election of a president are all going to be affected in the way that those things happen in the future and the public's acceptance of presidents in the future because of PR's role in being politically active. And you have a lot of lobbyists who are paid to do just this. They're paid to go into government and sit with senators, sit with elected representatives and try and change their minds about certain things, or trying to keep their minds set on certain things. The fracking industry in Pennsylvania is criticized for polluting the water. Fracking is about blasting water into rocks to free up natural gas, and the runoff is said to cause environmental damage. And the fracking companies, they have lobbyists that are meeting all the time with our PA elected representatives to stop that from happening, to stop fracking from being suspended, to allow it to go forward. So PR has a big role in political activism. And finally, PR has a big role in civil rights movements. Civil rights movements. Martin Luther King was a master of public relations, and his civil protests, nonviolence, getting put in jail, which he did in Alabama, is exactly what he wanted. He wanted public relations to be drawn to his pacifist tendencies. And so PR, and because of that, in the late 1960s, there was a lot of civil rights legislation that was passed. It was amazing what Martin Luther King was able to do. And he got his movement, his marches on Washington and his resistance in Alabama and his eventual speech that most of you have heard, the I Have a Dream speech. He got his movement covered by the New York Times and the Washington Post. And when he got arrested, he was released. And when he was released, he invited his children to the protests, giving riveting images to his campaign. And we can see the same kind of thing taking place with Black Lives Matter and calls to, and I'm not saying that I agreed with this, but calls to, quote, defund the police, which some people say is not really defunding, but it's a call to reform the police. It's a call to take a look at institutionalized racism and the way that African Americans and Latinos are prevented from achieving what white people are able to achieve. This is a nationwide conversation that's taking place right now, largely because of PR like a hashtag BLM. That in and of itself can push forward civil rights. So that wraps up our discussion on public relations. Have a great day.